Captain Eric Solomonson smelled the gun before he saw the tanks. It was the morning of February 25th, 1991. Somewhere below him, under a ceiling of black smoke from burning oil wells, an Iraqi armoured column was moving through the Kuwaiti desert. His wingman that day was First Lieutenant John Marks. Between them they had 2 aircraft, a narrow fuel window, and a weapon that had never once been fired at an enemy tank in a real war. The aircraft was called the A-10 Thunderbolt II. Almost nobody called it that. The men who flew it called it the Warthog. It was ugly, it was slow, and for 15 years the United States Air Force had been trying to get rid of it. Under each wing hung Maverick missiles. Nobody watching from the ground would remember those. They would remember the gun. The gun ran through the middle of the airframe like a spine. 7 barrels, 30mm, more than 19 feet long from the muzzle to the back of the ammunition drum. The entire aircraft had been designed around it, not fitted with it. Designed around it the way you build a house around a fireplace. Solomonson rolled in. The desert tilted up toward him. Before the day ended, he and Marks were going to have to keep count. Before we go on, let me ask you for something small. This is a small channel. It survives on people watching, subscribing, and sharing. If you value history that is researched properly, that tells you when the record is contested, and that does not simply repeat the legend, then please subscribe and leave a comment. It genuinely decides whether videos like this one keep getting made. Now, back to the desert. What Solomonson and Marks were about to do that day was the payoff of a bet the United States had placed nearly 20 years earlier, and had spent nearly 20 years trying to walk away from. Because for 4 decades, the central military fact of the Cold War in Europe was this: the Soviet Union and its allies had more tanks than the West could kill. Not slightly more, overwhelmingly more. And every serious NATO planner in every serious NATO capital understood that if the Warsaw Pact ever crossed the inner German border in earnest, the conventional defence of Western Europe might simply fail. The answer to that problem was not a new missile. It was not a secret satellite. It was not a nuclear weapon. The answer was a lesson the United States Air Force had already learned in Korea and then again in Vietnam, and had thrown away because it was unglamorous and because it belonged to a kind of flying the men running the Air Force did not respect. To understand how a single aircraft built around a single gun changed the arithmetic of a war that never happened, we have to go back to the moment the United States decided that close air support did not matter. Because that is the strange heart of this story. The weapon that finally made Soviet armor killable from the air was not invented, it was remembered. In 1948, the newly independent United States Air Force sat down with the other services and divided up the roles of American military power. The document that came out of those talks is usually called the Key West Agreement. It gave the Air Force strategic bombing, air superiority, and, on paper, close air support of ground troops. It sharply limited what fixed-wing combat aircraft the Army could operate. On paper, the Air Force owned the mission of supporting the soldier on the ground. In practice, it did not want it. The prestige of the new service lay in the long-range bomber, the nuclear deterrent, the interceptor climbing to meet Soviet aircraft. It did not lie in circling low over a muddy field at 200 miles an hour while a sergeant on a radio talked you onto a target 300 yards from his own position. That was not the future, that was a chore. And so through the 1950s and into the 1960s, American tactical aviation was built for speed. The F-100, the F-105, the F-4. Fast, complex, expensive, built to deliver nuclear weapons and to fight other aircraft. Then came Korea. Then came Vietnam, and in both wars, the same embarrassing thing kept happening. The aircraft that worked best over the battlefield was the old one. The Douglas A-1 Sky Raider was a piston engine attack aircraft. It had a propeller. It had been designed in the last months of the Second World War. By the standards of the jet age, it was a relic. It flew slowly. It looked wrong sitting on a ramp full of jets. And it was magnificent. It could carry an enormous load of ordnance in the region of 8,000 pounds, more than some 4 engine bombers of the previous war. It could stay over a target for hours, not minutes. Because it flew slowly, the pilot could see what he was shooting at and tell a friendly soldier from an enemy one. And because it was built like a hand tool, it could absorb ground fire that would have torn a jet apart. In Vietnam, the Sky Raider became the aircraft that rescued other pilots. When an American aviator went down in hostile territory, the Sky Raiders came. They escorted the rescue helicopters. They circled the survivor, sometimes for hours, holding off anything that came near. The call sign for that mission was Sandy, and among men who found themselves on the ground and alone, the sound of a Sky Raider engine was the sound of someone coming to get them. 2 of those men received the Medal of Honor for it. Major Bernard Fisher landed his Sky Raider on a wrecked burning airstrip in the Aishau Valley on March 10, 1966, under fire, to pick up a downed pilot who had crash-landed there and flew him out. Colonel William A. Jones III, on September 1, 1968, pressed a rescue attempt while his own aircraft was hit and burning and his radios were shot out. He had the chance to eject. He did not take it because if he ejected, the location of the man on the ground would be lost with him. He flew home with severe burns and reported the position. The Sky Raider paid for that work. The Air Force lost 191 of them in Southeast Asia. 150 were lost in combat. Meanwhile, the fast jets struggled. An F-4 crossing a tree line at 500 knots gave its pilot a fraction of a second to identify a target. It burned fuel so quickly that it could stay in the area only a few minutes. It could deliver enormous violence, but it could not linger, and it could not look. The lesson was not subtle. For supporting troops in contact, slow beat fast, tough beat sleek, and time over the target beat almost everything else. The Air Force learned that lesson twice in 2 different wars and put it away both times. And here the story turns because the Air Force did not rediscover close air support out of wisdom. It rediscovered it out of fear. Not fear of the Soviet Union. Fear of the United States Army. The Army had watched the same wars. The Army had drawn the same conclusions. And under the Key West Agreement, the Army could not build a fixed-wing attack aircraft. So it decided to build something that was not, technically, a fixed-wing attack aircraft. The program was called the Advanced Aerial Fire Support System, and what it produced was the Lockheed AH-56 Cheyenne. The Cheyenne was not a helicopter in any ordinary sense. It had a rigid rotor, stub wings, and a pusher propeller at the tail that drove it forward at speeds no helicopter of that era could touch. It carried a heavy gun and anti-tank missiles. It first flew on September 21, 1967. To the United States Air Force, it looked like exactly what it was. It looked like the Army building its own attack aircraft and calling it a helicopter. If the Cheyenne succeeded, the Air Force would lose the close air support mission it had spent 20 years neglecting. It would lose the budget line. It would lose the argument. An institution that had never wanted the job suddenly discovered that it very much did not want anyone else to have it. So the Air Force fought back, and the Cheyenne gave it plenty of ammunition. The program suffered a fatal crash. It ran into serious technical trouble with the rotor system. Costs climbed steeply from a few $100,000 per aircraft in the mid-1960s to several million. The production contract was cancelled in May 1969. The Army finally killed the entire program on August 9, 1972. And in the middle of that wreckage, the Senate looked at the problem and recommended something specific. It recommended funding the Air Force's own dedicated ground attack aircraft instead. That aircraft was called AX. So understand what actually happened here. The bureaucratic knife fight between 2 American services over who was allowed to help a soldier who was being shot at is the reason the A-10 exists. The Soviets did not force the Air Force to build it. The Army did. Now, the tanks. Because if the threat was not real, none of the rest matters. In the middle of Europe, the Soviet Union kept an army designed for one purpose. Not defense, not deterrence. Movement. Soviet armored thinking descended from the interwar theorists of deep battle, from men like Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky, who argued that a modern army should not merely break an enemy's front line, but tear through it and keep going, striking so deep and so fast that the enemy's rear collapsed before he could react. Stalin had Tukhachevsky shot in 1937. The idea outlived the man. By the late 1970s, the officer giving those ideas their sharpest modern form was Marshal Nikolai Ogarkov, chief of the Soviet General Staff from 1977 to 1984. Ogarkov was not a romantic 84. Ogarkov was not a romantic. He was a professional who looked hard at the mathematics of a European war and concluded that the Soviet Union had to win it quickly or not at all. Out of that thinking came the concept usually translated as the Operational Maneuver Group. The idea was simple and frightening. You hold a powerful armoured force back. You do not feed it into the grinding fight at the border. You wait. And the moment your first echelon punches a hole anywhere in the NATO line, you shove that reserve straight through the gap and you do not stop. You do not consolidate. You do not clear your flanks. You drive into the enemy's rear, into his airfields, his headquarters, his command chain, and you break the machine that would otherwise organize a defense. Speed was not a preference. Speed was the plan. In 1979, the Warsaw Pact produced an exercise plan that has since become famous, largely because of its name. It was called 7 Days to the River Rhine. Poland's defense minister, Radosław Sikorski, declassified it in 2005. In the scenario, Pact forces respond to a supposed NATO nuclear strike and then drive west, reaching the Rhine inside a week. 7 days. That was the schedule. Could they have done it? Historians genuinely disagree, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But the schedule is not the point. The intention is the point. That was the doctrine. That was the ambition. And NATO knew it. Now the numbers, and here I have to be careful because the numbers were contested at the time and remain contested today. Cold War tank counts depended enormously on who was counting and what they chose to count. The International Institute for Strategic Studies published figures suggesting the Warsaw Pact held a substantial armoured advantage in the central region of Europe, on the order of 2-1 or worse. The United States Department of Defense published estimates of the total Soviet main battle tank inventory running into the tens of thousands. The British government, looking at the same problem in the same decade, published a considerably lower figure for the Soviet tanks actually allotted to the Central Front. Those sources do not agree with each other, and you should be suspicious of anyone who quotes one of them as settled fact. Critics at the time pointed out correctly that a large share of that Soviet mass consisted of older T-54 and T-55 machines, and that the genuinely modern tanks were far fewer. They also pointed out correctly that frightening numbers were extremely useful to people who wanted larger defense budgets. All of that is true, and none of it changes the thing that mattered. In the central region of Europe, the Warsaw Pact had more armour than NATO, by a margin that serious estimates placed somewhere between roughly 2-1 and 3-1, and that armour was organised under a doctrine built entirely around exploiting that advantage at speed. NATO's response was to try to slow the Soviets down long enough to make a decision. American Army doctrine in the mid-1970s was called active defense. In 1982, it was replaced by air-land battle, which is the doctrine most people mean when they talk about how the West planned to fight in Europe. Air-land battle said something simple and demanding. You cannot only fight the enemy in front of you. You must reach deep behind him and destroy the follow-on echelons before they arrive, because if all of them arrive, you lose. Killing armour from the air in depth was therefore not an optional extra. It was a load-bearing assumption of Western defence, and the tanks themselves had become much harder to kill. The T-64 entered Soviet service in the 1960s. The T-72 followed in 1973. The T-80 came after. These were not the T-34s of the last war. They carried composite armour arrays. Their frontal protection was measured in hundreds of millimetres of effective thickness. Later versions carried explosive reactive armour bolted to the glacis and the turret, designed specifically to defeat the shaped charge warheads that most Western anti-tank missiles relied on. Hitting one of these tanks in the face with almost anything was a poor idea, but the men who designed them had made a choice, and that choice opened the seam this entire story runs through. To keep the T-64 and the T-72 small and light, Soviet engineers deleted the human loader and replaced him with an autoloader. The ammunition came in two pieces, a projectile and a separate propellant charge, and it sat in a carousel in the floor of the fighting compartment. It sat inside the crew space. There were no blowout panels. There was no armoured bulkhead between the men and the propellant. The T-72's carousel held 22 rounds. More were stowed elsewhere in the hull, which meant that if anything at all reached the inside of that tank, the propellant could ignite, and the resulting pressure had nowhere to go except through the crew and out through the roof. Soldiers eventually gave that effect a name that is now grimly famous. The turret does not fall off. It goes up. And the roof of a Soviet tank, the turret top, the engine deck, the rear plate, was not measured in hundreds of millimeters. It was measured in tens. There was a way in. It was simply not on the ground. The Air Force began forming a requirement for an aircraft it called AX in the middle of the 1960s. In March 1967, requests went out to 21 companies. Study contracts followed. In April 1970, the concept was approved at the level of the Deputy Secretary of Defense. In May 1970, the final request for proposals went out. In December 1970, prototype contracts went to Fairchild Republic and to Northrop. The specification, by the standards of the jet age, was almost insulting. Maximum speed around 460 miles per hour. Takeoff distance 4,000 feet, which meant operating from damaged strips and rough forward fields close to the front. External load of 16,000 pounds. Mission radius around 285 miles and a unit cost target of $1.4 million in 1970 dollars. That last number matters more than any of the others. This was not to be a prestige aircraft. It was to be cheap enough to buy in quantity and, by implication, cheap enough to lose. There was a second request for proposals, issued separately for the weapon. A 30mm cannon with a very high rate of fire and a very high muzzle velocity. The gun requirement was not an accessory. Everyone involved understood that the gun was the aircraft. The officer most responsible for forcing AX through the institution was Colonel Avery Kay. Kay was not a fighter pilot. He had been a B-17 lead navigator in the Second World War, including the Schweinfurt raid of 1943, which was one of the most costly missions the American bomber force ever flew. He knew precisely what it was to be shot at, while flying straight and level and unable to maneuver. Kay spent years advocating for an aircraft much of the fighter community regarded with open contempt. It was slow. It could not dogfight. In the language of the Officers' Club, it was not a real airplane. Championing it was not a career-enhancing move. Kay did it anyway, and he never wore a general's star. When Avery Kay was buried at Arlington in March 2016, 4 A-10s flew over the cemetery in missing man formation. There is another name attached to this story, and honesty requires me to handle it carefully because the popular version of it is wrong. Pierre Sprey was a civilian analyst in the Office of the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Systems Analysis, one of the group of young quantitative thinkers brought in under Robert McNamara. Sprey was involved in the AX concept work and in shaping what the requirement asked for. He is frequently described across the internet and in more than one documentary as the man who designed the A-10. He did not design the A-10. Sprey held an engineering degree, but he was not an aircraft designer, and he was not a pilot. The historian Marshall Michel, who studied this period closely, wrote bluntly that Sprey had nothing to do with designing the aircraft and criticized his later self-promotion. Sprey was a real participant with real influence over what the Air Force asked for. He was not the author of the airframe, and he did not draw it. Sprey belonged to an informal group inside the Pentagon that later became known as the Fighter Mafia. Its central figure was Colonel John Boyd, the man behind energy maneuverability theory and the decision cycle that engineers and business schools now call the Ooda loop. Another member, Colonel Everest Riccioni, coined the group's nickname as a joke about the bomber generals of an earlier era. Their real product was the lightweight fighter, the line of thinking that produced the F-16. Their slogan for that project was, famously, not 1 pound for air to ground. On the A-10, Boyd was largely uninvolved. By Sprey's own account, Boyd would clap him on the back, tell him he was doing great and leave him to it. And there is an irony here that is going to matter enormously by the end of this story. That group argued against burdening the A-10 with guided anti-tank missiles. They wanted the gun, and the gun above all. The A-10 carried the missile anyway, and in the only war where the A-10 ever fought the enemy it was built to fight, it was the missile, not the gun, that did most of the killing. 2 prototypes were built. Northrop offered the YA-9. Fairchild Republic offered the YA-10. Fairchild Republic mattered for a reason that was almost sentimental. The company was the descendant of Republic Aviation, whose chief designer, Alexander Kartveli, had produced the P-47 Thunderbolt of the Second World War. The P-47 was famous for 2 things. It was enormously heavy and heavily armed, and it could absorb punishment that would have destroyed any other fighter of its generation and still bring its pilot home. When the new attack aircraft was named, it was named Thunderbolt II, and the name was not marketing. It was a statement of design philosophy. The YA-10 first flew on May 10, 1972, with pilot Howard Nelson at the controls. The Air Force flew the two prototypes against each other at Edwards Air Force Base in California between October and December 1972. On January 18, 1973, the Air Force announced that Fairchild had won. The reasons had mostly to do with survivability. Northrop's design buried its engines in the wing roots, tight against the fuselage, which meant that a single well-placed hit could take out both engines and the pilot's chances in the same instant. Fairchild's design did something that looks ridiculous in a photograph and was actually brilliant. It put the engines in pods high up behind the wing on either side of the tail. Almost every design decision on this aircraft came from the same question. Not, how do we make it fast? How do we make it come home? The pilot sat inside a bathtub of titanium armor, 1,200 pounds of it. The plates ran from half an inch to an inch and a half thick, and the tub was tested to stop 23mm armor-piercing rounds, which is to say, the standard Soviet anti-aircraft cannon round of the era. The inside was lined with a nylon spall shield because armor that stops a projectile can still throw fragments of itself through a man. The flight controls were doubly redundant with two separate hydraulic systems. Behind both sat a purely mechanical backup called manual reversion, which meant that if every hydraulic line on the aircraft was cut and drained, the pilot could still fly it home, on cables, muscle, and a great deal of sweat. The fuel tanks were self-sealing and filled with foam to suppress explosion and placed inboard away from the wingtips. The high-mounted rear engines meant the exhaust was partially shielded from below by the wing and the tailplane, which reduced the heat signature a missile from the ground would hunt for. It also meant the intakes sat high and clear of debris, so the aircraft could work from unpaved strips. That was not a luxury. In a real European war, every proper runway in West Germany was expected to be cratered by Soviet missiles within hours. The twin vertical tails meant that losing one did not mean losing control. The aircraft was designed to fly with one engine gone, one tail gone, one elevator gone, and a substantial part of one wing gone. Two General Electric TF-34 turbofans gave it 9,065 pounds of thrust each. That was not much. It was never meant to be. 11 hardpoints, 16,000 pounds of ordnance. On a close support mission, it could hold over the battlefield for nearly 2 hours before going home. 715 were built between 1972 and 1984, counting the two prototypes, and 6 development aircraft. The first went to the 355th Wing at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona in March 1976. The first combat-ready unit was the 354th at Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, in October 1977. And forward they went to England and to rotating forward operating locations in West Germany, sitting a short flight from the Fulda Gap, waiting for a war everybody expected and nobody wanted. Now, the gun. General Electric and Philco Ford were selected in 1971 to build competing prototypes of the 30mm cannon. General Electric won. The weapon was designated the GAU-8, and it was named Avenger. The complete gun system, meaning the cannon, the feed mechanism, and the ammunition drum, runs about 19.5 feet long. It is roughly the length of a compact car. There is a famous photograph in which it is parked beside a Volkswagen Beetle for comparison, and the gun does not lose. Loaded, the whole assembly weighs a little over 4,000 pounds, more than the empty weight of many light aircraft. If a maintenance crew needs to pull the gun out of an A-10, they first have to put a support under the tail. If they do not, the aircraft tips over backward and sits down on its rear fuselage because the gun is most of what is holding the nose on the ground. That is not a metaphor. That is a maintenance procedure. It tells you exactly what this aircraft is. Not an airplane with a gun in it. A gun with an airplane wrapped around it. 7 barrels rotate. The rate of fire, as fielded, is 3,900 rounds per minute, about 65 rounds every second. Muzzle velocity is a little over 3,300 feet per second. The drum holds 1,174 rounds. At full rate, the aircraft could empty its entire load in roughly 18 seconds of continuous fire. In practice, pilots fired in bursts of 1 or 2 seconds. To conserve ammunition, to preserve the barrels, and because you do not need more than that. The recoil of the GAU-8 is roughly 10,000 pounds of force. Each engine produces about 9,065 pounds of thrust. And here I have to stop and kill a myth because it is the single most repeated claim about this aircraft, and it is not true. You have probably heard that firing the gun slows the A-10 so violently that it stops in mid-air, or flies backward, or falls out of the sky. It does not. It never has. It cannot. Here is what is true. The recoil is real. It does exceed the thrust of one engine. At higher speeds, a long burst will noticeably decelerate the aircraft, and pilots describe it as feeling like you have touched the brakes. Here is what is also true. An aircraft flying at 300 miles an hour does not stop because it loses a few miles an hour. It slows. Thrust and drag find a new balance. It flies on. And the recoil, while enormous, is roughly half the combined thrust of both engines, not more than it. The story that the gun stops the plane is a good story. It is also nonsense, and the engineers who built the thing would have been embarrassed by it. There was, however, a real engineering problem, and it very nearly wrecked the program. When the gun fired, it produced a huge cloud of propellant gas in front of the aircraft. That gas is essentially free of oxygen, and the aircraft then flew directly into it. The engines began to flame out. Sit with that for a moment. The entire reason the aircraft existed was the gun, and when the gun fired, the engines could stop. The fix was not glamorous, which is fitting. Engineers redesigned the engine combustion section to be self-sustaining and wired the igniters so that they fire automatically whenever the trigger is pulled. Since then, when an A-10 pilot shoots, the engines are being continuously relit in anticipation of being choked. The gun is mounted off-center, slightly to the left of the aircraft's centerline, which looks like a mistake and is not. Because the barrels rotate, only one barrel fires at any instant, and that barrel sits at roughly the 9 o'clock position of the cluster. By offsetting the whole assembly, the designers placed the firing barrel exactly on the aircraft's centerline, just below the center of gravity, aimed 2 degrees below the line of flight. That way the recoil pushes straight back through the airframe instead of twisting it. Without that offset, every burst would have yawed the nose off the target. To make room for it, the nose landing gear was shifted to the right. Then there is the ammunition. The main anti-armor round is the PGU-14. It is an armor-piercing incendiary round with a penetrator made of depleted uranium, alloyed with a small percentage of titanium. The penetrator weighs about 2/3 of a pound. Depleted uranium was chosen for 2 properties. It is extraordinarily dense, so it carries kinetic energy through armor instead of deforming against it. And it is pyrophoric, so as it penetrates, the fragments burn. The round does not simply make a hole, it sprays burning metal into the compartment behind the hole. Mixed in with those is the PGU-13, a high-explosive incendiary round for softer targets. The standard combat load runs roughly 4 or 5 armor-piercing rounds for every high-explosive round. Now, the honest question, what could it actually get through? Published figures give roughly 69mm of armor at 500 meters and around 38mm at 1,000 meters when the round strikes square on with no obliquity. At an angle, the numbers change and they get worse. Compare that to the frontal armor of a T-72, which is a composite array with an effective thickness in the hundreds of millimeters, and which on later models carries explosive reactive armor bolted on top of that. So let me be clear, because the internet is not. The GAU-8 cannot shoot through the front of a T-72. It never could. Any claim that it could is false. What it could do is hit the roof. That is the entire concept. The A-10 was never supposed to meet a tank face to face. It was supposed to come out of a shallow dive from above and behind and put a stream of depleted uranium through the engine deck, the turret roof, and the rear plate where Soviet armor was thin and where, inside a T-72, that carousel of propellant was waiting on the other side. The doctrine, the weapon, and the enemy's own design choices all met at a single point on the top of the tank. And we have a real test that shows what that meant in practice. It is worth quoting precisely because it is unflattering. On November 7th, 1979, at Nellis Air Force Base, the Air Force ran a trial in which an A-10 attacked a formation of 10 M47 Patton tanks, standing in for Soviet armor. The aircraft fired 174 rounds in short bursts at an average range of about 753 meters. Roughly 90 rounds hit the tanks. Of those, only about 30 penetrated. 3 tanks were destroyed. 4 were immobilized. 3 suffered damage to their weapon systems. Read that carefully because it tells you both things at once. The gun worked, and the gun was not magic. Most rounds missed, Most hits did not go through. What mattered was that enough did, and that the aircraft could come around and do it again and survive doing so. Critics of the A-10 have been quoting that test ever since, and they are entitled to. That was the theory. The theory was about to spend 15 years being ignored, undermined, and very nearly cancelled, because the United States Air Force still did not want this aircraft. It had built the A-10 to stop the Army from taking the close air support mission. Having built it and having won that fight, the institution promptly went back to being what it had always been. An air force run by fighter pilots and bomber generals who regarded a slow attack aircraft as a career dead end. Through the 1980s, the Air Force pushed an alternative, sometimes called the A-16. The idea was to take the F-16, a fast, modern, prestigious fighter, and adapt it for close air support. Part of that effort involved hanging a gun pod under the F-16 carrying a shortened 4-barrel derivative of the GAU-8. They tried it. The pod held enough ammunition for about 9 seconds of firing. The recoil twisted the pylon. Accuracy was poor. When the pod was carried into combat in 1991, it was withdrawn after roughly a single day. That should have settled the argument. It did not. The push to replace the A-10 with something faster and more respectable continued right through the end of the decade. Meanwhile, the aircraft had genuine problems of its own. The wings developed structural fatigue cracks. Eventually, this would demand an expensive wing replacement program to keep the fleet flying, and that program would itself become a political football. And there was a deeper fear, and it was not irrational. The A-10 had been designed to fly low over a European battlefield. But by the late 1970s, the airspace over that battlefield was the most heavily defended airspace in the history of aviation. The Soviets had built an integrated, layered mobile air defense system that traveled with the tanks. The ZSU-23-4. Shilka, a radar-directed anti-aircraft gun on a tracked chassis, could throw an enormous volume of fire into the sky. Around it and behind it were the SA-6, the SA-8, the SA-9 and the SA-13. Mobile surface-to-air missiles that moved with the armoured columns and did not have to stop to shoot. The A-10's job was to fly directly into that. Nobody in the Air Force believed the losses would be tolerable. The war games and studies of the period painted a bleak picture, and while the specific attrition figures people quote vary so widely that I am not going to put a number on it, the general conclusion was consistent. In a real Central European war, A-10s would die in large numbers and they would die fast. The men who flew it knew this. The plan was to stay low, hide behind terrain, pop up, shoot, and vanish. To accept that a percentage of them would not come back, and to trade those aircraft for tanks NATO could not otherwise stop. That was the bargain. It was never pretty, and it was never tested. That is the strangest fact in this entire story. The A-10 was designed for one war, one theatre, one enemy. It sat in Europe for 15 years. It never fired a shot at a Soviet tank. It never fired a shot in anger anywhere. It was not used in Grenada. It was not used in Panama. The Cold War ended without the test. The aircraft that had been built to kill Soviet armour entered the 1990s having never killed anything at all, unwanted by its own service, with cracks in its wings and with plans already drawn up to replace it. And then, in August 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait. The Iraqi army in 1990 was, in equipment and doctrine, a Soviet army. It fielded Soviet tanks. Its armoured formations were organised on Soviet lines. Its air defences were built on Soviet systems. It had the T-55, the T-62, and the T-72. It was not the Red Army. Its training was worse. Its command system was more rigid. Its air force was swept from the sky in days. Nobody should pretend that Iraq in 1991 was the Warsaw Pact in 1985. It was not, but it was the closest thing the A-10 was ever going to get to the enemy it was built for. The commander of coalition air forces was Lieutenant General Chuck Horner, and Horner did not want the A-10 in his war. He was a fighter pilot. He thought the aircraft was too slow and too vulnerable and that it would be shot down at a rate he could not accept. He was overruled. The A-10s deployed. Roughly 140 of them went, along with the forward air control variant, the OA-10. And now the arithmetic that 15 years of institutional argument had produced was finally going to meet real armour, in real time, flown by men who had never done it before. Here is what the aircraft actually had going for it, stated plainly. The Iraqi tanks had thin top armor and thin rear armor, exactly as Soviet designs did, because they were Soviet designs. The T-72 carried its ammunition carousel inside the crew compartment. The A-10 could loiter. It could stay over an area long enough to actually find things, which no fast jet could do. It could take a hit. It was built to come home broken. And it carried both the gun and, under the wings, the AGM-65 Maverick, the guided missile that purists had argued against. What it did not have was any protection from the thing that would actually kill it, which was a surface-to-air missile fired by a soldier who saw it coming. The armor stopped bullets and fragments. It did not stop missiles. And the aircraft was slow and the desert was flat and there was nowhere to hide. The air campaign opened on January 17th, 1991. 4 days in, on January 21st, Captain Paul Johnson led a pair of A-10s under the call sign Sandy 57. A Navy F-14 had been shot down deep inside Iraq. One crewman, Lieutenant Devon Jones, was on the ground and alive. The other had been captured. The call sign was not an accident. Sandy was the Sky Raiders' call sign in Vietnam. The mission Johnson flew that day was the mission the Sky Raiders had invented, being flown by the aircraft that had been built to replace them. He was airborne for hours. He refueled 3 times. He searched for roughly 3 hours, going deeper into Iraq than any A-10 had gone, descending at times to a few hundred feet, in daylight, over open desert, in what was at that moment the most dangerous airspace on Earth. Along the way, he attacked what appeared to be a missile site. When he finally found Jones, an Iraqi truck was moving toward the survivor's position. Johnson destroyed it, then held overhead while a helicopter came in and lifted the pilot out. For that, Paul Johnson received the Air Force Cross. Only 2 were awarded to airmen in the entire Gulf War. 2 weeks later, on February 6, a shoulder-fired missile hit Johnson's aircraft and blew a hole through the right wing, wrecking a hydraulic system and crippling the right engine. He flew it back to Saudi Arabia and landed it. That same day, February 6, 1991, Captain Robert Swain of the 706th Squadron was flying near Kuwait when he found an Iraqi helicopter in the air below him. Swain rolled in and fired the gun. He shot it down. It was the first air-to-air kill in the history of the A-10. Swain later said the wreckage was in so many pieces that the helicopter could not be positively identified afterward. On February 15th, Captain Todd Sheehy did it again, destroying a second Iraqi helicopter with the cannon. Those 2 remain the only air-to-air gun kills of the entire war, scored by the aircraft everybody had said was too slow to survive. And then came the ground war and the thing the aircraft had actually been built for. By late February, the Iraqi armoured formations in Kuwait and southern Iraq were being hunted continuously. The A-10s worked in pairs, low in daylight, over the same patch of desert for hours at a time. On February 25th, Captain Eric Solomonson and First Lieutenant John Marks flew 3 sorties in a single day. Between them, they destroyed 23 tanks. They found them, worked them methodically, went home, refueled, rearmed, and came back. Marks described the pattern himself afterward. On the first sortie, 6 tanks fell to Maverick missiles and 2 to the gun. On the second, 6 more to Mavericks and 2 to the gun. The third accounted for the rest. Marks was 26 years old. Solomonson described the difference between what they were doing and what everyone else was doing. His squadron, he said, was coming back with more confirmed damage than any other aircraft. And then he added something that tells you exactly what kind of pilot and what kind of aircraft this was. They only reported the things they actually saw blowing up or on fire. Hold on to that sentence because it is about to become the most important one in this story. Across the war, the A-10 force flew somewhere around 8,000 sorties. It held a mission-capable rate of 95.7%, which, for an aircraft the Air Force had spent a decade trying to retire, is a quietly devastating statistic. And it launched roughly 90% of all the Maverick missiles fired in the conflict. The aircraft that was built around a gun by men who had argued that guided missiles were a distraction spent its only real war firing guided missiles. And when the shooting stopped, the Air Force credited the A-10 force with destroying 987 tanks, 926 artillery pieces, 1,355 other combat vehicles, 10 aircraft destroyed on the ground, and 2 helicopters shot down in the air. Those numbers went around the world, they are still quoted today. And most of them are wrong. Not fabricated, not dishonest. Wrong in the specific, entirely human way that combat claims are almost always wrong. Men in cockpits, moving at 300 miles an hour, looking down through smoke at a burning battlefield, counted things twice. They counted things that were already dead. They counted things that had never been alive. Now the ledger, and the ledger is where this story earns the right to be believed. The first thing that went wrong on February 15th, 1991. That day, a TENS went after Republican Guard divisions roughly 60 miles northwest of Kuwait City. The Republican Guard was the real Iraqi army. It had the modern equipment. It was the part that would stand and fight. 2 A-10s were shot down. The engagements are generally attributed to the SA-13, one of the mobile missile systems that had haunted Air Force planners since the 1970s. First Lieutenant Robert Sweet ejected and was captured. He was released in early March. Captain Stephen Phillis was his flight lead. Phillis stayed. He remained over his downed wingman in the middle of an active air defense engagement, and he was shot down and killed doing it. He was awarded the Silver Star posthumously. Chuck Horner, the general who had never wanted the aircraft in the first place, described the moment bluntly afterward. He said he had a row of aircraft sitting on the ramp being repaired for battle damage, and that he lost 2 A-10s in one day, and that he had had enough of it. From that day, the A-10s were pulled back. They were restricted to operating within about 20 nautical miles of the southern border. The Republican Guard, the hardest target, the one closest to what the aircraft had been designed for, was handed to the F-16s. Read that again, because it is the sentence the legend leaves out. When the A-10 went up against the best equipped, most alert, most heavily defended armoured formations in Iraq, the coalition's own air commander took it off the target after a single bad afternoon. Everything the critics had said about a slow aircraft in a modern air defense environment was, in that narrow and painful instance, correct. Then, on February 26th, 2 A-10s attacked a group of armoured vehicles they identified as Iraqi tanks. They were not Iraqi. They were British Warriors, infantry fighting vehicles belonging to a battle group of the Royal Regiment of Fusiliers. The A-10s fired Maverick missiles, 1 each. 9 British soldiers were killed. 11 were wounded. It was the worst air-to-ground friendly fire incident of the war. A British board of inquiry could not establish why the vehicles had been misidentified and did not establish that the American pilots were at fault. A later inquest in Oxford returned a verdict of unlawful killing. Horner's own summary was that the American investigation found the pilots believed they were exactly where they were supposed to be, and that no jury could have convicted anyone. 9 men were dead anyway, and their families have lived with that ambiguity ever since. Any honest account of this aircraft includes them. And notice the weapon. Not the gun, the missile. In a separate incident, a Maverick fired by an A-10 struck a United States Marine Corps light armoured vehicle. 7 Marines were killed. That pattern holds all the way down. The great majority of A-10 armour kills in the Gulf War were made with Maverick missiles and with bombs, not with the 30mm cannon. The aircraft the world remembers for its gun did most of its killing with a missile that its own champions had argued against. And the missile, not the gun, is what killed the men on its own side. Now the tank counts, and this is where it gets uncomfortable. In 1996, the United States General Accounting Office published a report on the effectiveness of the air campaign. Its conclusions were not kind to anybody. The report found that when the Air Force reviewed the claims of its own pilots, for every 3 tanks claimed by A-10 pilots, only 1 was credited. That is a 33% credit rate. For comparison, F-111 crews, dropping laser-guided bombs at night from medium altitude, were credited with about 50% of their claims. So the famous figure of 987 tanks is not a count of destroyed tanks. It is a count of claims. The credited figure is far lower, and the credited figure is not the end of it either. When American teams went into the theatre afterward and physically inspected Iraqi tanks, they found something that should be part of every conversation about air power, and almost never is. A very large share of the tanks, close to half in the sample they examined, had not been destroyed by anybody. They had been abandoned intact by their crews or wrecked by the Iraqis themselves before they walked away. And of the actual hits found on the tanks that had been hit, only a small fraction had come from weapons delivered by aircraft. Most had come from ground forces. The Central Intelligence Agency ran a separate study using aerial photography and credited air power with a far larger share of the destruction. But the General Accounting Office criticized that method because it had a way of counting any tank that had stopped moving as an air kill, and a great many Iraqi tanks stopped moving for the simple reason that the men inside them had walked home. Add up what every aircraft type in the coalition claimed, and the total comes to more tanks than Iraq is believed to have had in the theatre. The claims of the parts exceed the whole. That is not a scandal. That is what happens in every war ever fought. The only scandal would be if nobody went back afterward and checked. And there is one more finding, and it is the most uncomfortable of all for anyone who loves this aircraft. The F-111, flying at night from medium altitude, dropping 500-pound laser-guided bombs in an operation whose crews nicknamed it Tank Plinking, was credited with more than 1,500 armor kills. It was extraordinarily efficient, and it was doing this from an altitude where almost nothing on the ground could reach it. The General Accounting Office was careful to say it could not identify any single aircraft as clearly more effective than another, and I'm not going to overstate what the report actually concluded. But the implication is hard to escape. A precision bomb, released from safety in the dark, killed tanks with far less risk to the man delivering it than a gun run at 700 meters in broad daylight. Everything the A-10 was, the armor, the redundancy, the ability to absorb a hit and keep flying, existed to solve a problem that the laser-guided bomb solved by not being there in the first place. That is not a takedown of the A-10. It is the beginning of an argument that started in 1991 and has still not ended. There is one more piece of evidence, and it cuts the other way, and it belongs here. When coalition interrogators questioned Iraqi prisoners after the war, they asked which aircraft the soldiers had feared most. The answer was not the stealth fighter. It was not the attack helicopter. It was the B-52, which they never saw, and the A-10, which they saw constantly. The men on the ground were not consulted about the retirement plans. Colonel Avery Kay, the navigator who forced the AX program through an institution that despised it, did not become famous. There is no film about him. Most people who can identify an A-10 on sight have never heard his name, and he retired without ever making general. Pierre Sprey became famous and became more famous than the record supports, and spent the rest of his life being introduced as the designer of an aircraft he did not design. Captain Stephen Phillis was killed on February 15th, 1991, staying above a man on the ground who could not help himself. Robert Sweet came home. The Republican Guard, the target they had died attacking, was reassigned to somebody else the same day. Eric Solomonson, asked about the day he and John Marks destroyed 23 tanks, said something notably unheroic. He did not talk about courage, he talked about bookkeeping. He said they only counted what they actually saw burning. Paul Johnson stayed in the Air Force and retired as a Major General in 2016 with more than 3,000 flight hours. The man who flew for hours into Iraq at a few hundred feet to bring back one stranger did not build a public career on it, and the aircraft itself received for its service precisely the reward it had received before the war. The Air Force tried again to retire it. It tried in the 1990s when the Soviet Union no longer existed, and the tank army the A-10 had been built to kill had dissolved into rust across a dozen new countries. It tried in the 2000s. It tried hardest in the middle of the 2010s, arguing that the F-35 would absorb the close air support mission, and the Warthog could finally be flown to the boneyard. In January 2015, a two-star general named James Post told a room of roughly 300 airmen at Nellis Air Force Base that anyone who went to Congress to advocate for keeping the A-10 would be committing treason. That was the word. Treason. The Inspector General later confirmed he had said it and found that the remark had a chilling effect on airmen's legal right to speak to their elected representatives. Post was removed from his position and reprimanded in April of that year. He apologized, saying it had never been his intention to discourage anyone's access to their elected officials. Congress refused to let the aircraft die. One of the loudest voices belonged to a retired Air Force colonel named Martha McSally, who had commanded an A-10 squadron, who had logged more than 325 combat hours, and who had been the first American woman to fly a fighter in combat and the first to command a fighter squadron. She went to Capitol Hill and argued that you do not retire the aircraft that protects the soldier on the ground until you have something that demonstrably does the job better. And that fight is still running. For the 2026 budget year, the Air Force asked to retire every remaining A-10, all 162 of them. Immediately, years ahead of the schedule it had previously agreed to. Congress said no. The Defense Authorization Act set a floor and forbade the fleet from dropping below 103 aircraft, and required the Air Force to explain, aircraft by aircraft, exactly what it intended to do and when. And then, in April of this year, the Secretary of the Air Force confirmed something that would have sounded absurd in 1991. The A-10 will now remain in service until 2030. 715 were built. A little over 100 will still be flying at the end of this decade. The service that never wanted them, that called advocacy for them treason, that has tried to kill them in 4 separate decades, keeps being told to go back and try again. There is no other American combat aircraft with a story like that. It is a story about an institution that has never been able to answer the question Avery Kay asked in 1966. If not this, then what? And the problem the A-10 was invented to solve did not disappear when the Soviet Union collapsed. It went to sleep. In February 2022, it woke up. When Russia invaded Ukraine, it brought the direct descendants of the tanks the A-10 had been designed to kill. The T-72, upgraded and upgraded again. The T-80, the same hull layout, the same carousel of propellant sitting in the floor of the crew compartment, the same catastrophically thin roof, and the Ukrainians did to them precisely what the GAU-8 had been designed to do, using tools that nobody in 1970 would have recognized as weapons at all. The Javelin missile climbs above a tank and dives into the top plate. The NLAW flies over the tank and fires downward as it passes. And then came the thing that changed everything, which is a small commercial drone with an explosive charge strapped to it, flown by a young person watching a video screen straight into the engine deck. The visually confirmed losses are staggering. Open source tracking, the kind that requires a photograph of each individual vehicle before it is counted, has documented more than 4,000 Russian main battle tanks destroyed, damaged, abandoned or captured, alongside thousands of other armoured vehicles. Those are only the ones somebody photographed. The real figure is higher. And according to analysis published by the Royal United Services Institute, tactical drones are now inflicting roughly 2/3 of Russian equipment losses. NATO reached a similar conclusion about Russian tank losses. The United States spent 2 decades and an enormous amount of money and a great deal of institutional blood to build an aircraft that could put a burning penetrator through the roof of a Soviet tank. The men who built it had to fight their own service to do it. The aircraft was resented, delayed, nearly cancelled, deployed against the wrong enemy, and is being retired before the argument about it was ever settled. And today the roof of a Russian tank is being opened by a machine that costs a few $100s and is flown by a conscript in a basement. The principle was right. It was always right. Soviet armour was strong in front and weak on top, and the way to kill it was to come from above. The A-10 proved that principle with 4,000 pounds of rotating steel and a fuselage built like a bank vault. Ukraine is proving the same principle with a hobby aircraft and a shaped charge. The weapon was never the point. The angle was the point. For 4 decades, the tank armies of the Soviet Union sat in the middle of Europe, and the West had no confident answer to them. The answer, when it came, was not a breakthrough. It was a lesson the United States Air Force had already learned from a propeller-driven relic over Korea and Vietnam, and had thrown away twice because it was beneath the dignity of the institution. It took a bureaucratic war with the United States Army to force the Air Force to pick that lesson back up. It took a bomber navigator who had been shot at over Germany to carry it through. It took a gun so large the aircraft had to be built around it. And it took a war against the wrong enemy to prove that any of it worked, and a set of honest audits afterward to prove that it had not worked nearly as well as everybody said. That is the real story, and it is better than the legend. In the legend, the gun is invincible, the tank explodes, and everybody cheers. In the real story, the gun cannot penetrate the front of a T-72. Most of the kills were scored by a missile the designers did not want. 16 Allied soldiers died to that missile in incidents nobody could fully explain, and 2 pilots were shot down over the Republican Guard on a February afternoon before their own commander pulled the fleet off the target. The A-10 Thunderbolt II was never the invincible machine of the internet. It was something more useful than that, and rarer. It was the aircraft that was willing to go low and stay there when nothing else would. Captain Stephen Phillis had a choice in the sky over southern Iraq on February 15, 1991. He could have left. He stayed with his wingman in an aircraft nobody had wanted, over a battlefield in a war it was not built for, above the last army in the world still organized on Soviet lines. That is where the Cold War's answer to the Soviet tank finally got its test. Not in the Fulda Gap. Not on the North German plain. On a stretch of desert 60 miles northwest of Kuwait City, 35 years ago on a Friday afternoon,